بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نويت التعلم والتعليم وتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم ودعاء إلى الهدى ودلالة على الخير ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. Alhamdulillah. So yesterday we spoke about the battle of Badr, which is from the greatest of battles, as we mentioned, and where the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in regards to the 313 men that if this group of men, this band of men are killed, that you will not be worshipped on this earth again, in regards to which shows their lofty stations, radiyallahu ta'ala anhum. So now today we will look at what took place immediately after the battle of Badr. So we mentioned Badr was on the 17th of Ramadan, and so now once the battle had finished and the Muslims returned to Mecca, to Medina, and the Quraysh returned to Mecca, and news spread throughout Arabia that the Muslims had beaten this great army of the Quraysh, 1,000 men that came out to fight, and the Muslims were such low and small number, and they had beaten them. And so fear spread amongst the other tribes and around Arabia, and rather than the Quraysh people being in awe of the Quraysh, people were now in awe of the Muslims and the people of Medina. And so news came back to Mecca that the Quraysh had lost. This was before the army had returned, and Abu Lahab was still in Mecca because he didn't go to the battle. So he remained in Mecca, and he remained because Abu Jahl's brother owed him some money. So Abu Lahab sent Abu Jahl's brother instead in his place. He said, "You will go and because you owe me money, you will go and fight instead of me going out to fight," which shows his cowardness. And so Abu Lahab remained in Mecca, and then the news came back that the Quraysh had lost the battle. And so Abu Lahab, now angry when he heard this, he went straight marching to the Kaaba, to where all the heads and the chiefs sit, but nobody was there. And then Abu Sufyan arrives at that time. And so Abu Jahl, he angrily says to Abu Sufyan, he says, "Is this what's happened, that we've lost a battle and the Muslims have won and the people of Muhammad have won?" And Abu Sufyan verifies that what he's heard is true, and that he tells him that so many of our army has been killed, and so many of the chiefs have been killed, so and so has been killed. And Abu Lahab is now left astonished and concerned that so many of their leaders have been killed and so many have been captive. And what will they now do to free their captives? And so Abu Sufyan tells Abu Lahab, he says, "No, don't blame the people, don't blame our people, don't blame our army, our soldiers that went out to fight," because he says that there was these white people wearing white, men wearing white, that came to help them. So they had some sort of aid from another tribe or another group of men, but they were all wearing white, and they came to help the Muslims. And so now Abu Lahab is even more angry, and while he's there at the Kaaba, there was also an old man, a Muslim, Abu Rafi, and Sayyidina Abbas's wife Lubaba. They were present there. And when Rafi heard Abu Sufyan mention that there was these men wearing white, he said excitedly, he said, "They were angels." So he couldn't hold his excitement, and it came out, and he mentioned, he was like, "They were angels." And Abu Lahab, in anger, he hears this, he smacks Abu Rafi, and Abu Rafi is an old man, and so he smacks Abu Rafi and he begins to beat him, and he beats him until Lubaba, who's Abbas's wife, radiyallahu ta'ala anhum, she picks up a pole and she smacks Abu Lahab on the head. And when she smacks him on the head, and she says to him, "Do you think you can abuse him just because Abbas isn't here?" Because Abbas had gone out for battle at Badr. So she says, "Just because Abbas isn't here, do you think that you can abuse this man, this old man?" And she hit him so hard that she cracked open his head, and that the wound was so deep that they say you were able to see his skull. And so now Abu Lahab, he goes off to treat his wound, and it becomes infected, and pus begins to pour out of it and all out, and it affects his whole body, where now his body has these pustules and it has boils all over his body, and he dies a week later from that wound and from the infection in the wound. And they mentioned that the smell from his body was so strong that his family, so he's now dead, Abu Lahab, and his family left his body for 3 days because nobody wanted to go near him, because they were worried about catching this infectious disease that he had, and that the smell, the stench that they had smelt before was coming from him. And so they didn't want, even his own family didn't want to approach the body, so he was left alone to die. And that's how he died. And so his family then left him in his home, and they didn't go to treat him or didn't go to bury him until the other Quraysh rebuked him, them, and they said that you need to bury your family member, your father and so and so. And so this was after 3 days that then his family hire slaves to wash his body from far away. That water was thrown at him, that they didn't want to, even these slaves, they didn't want to go near him, and they threw water at him from far away. And then they used poles to push his body and drag his body, and they dug a grave outside of Mecca for his body. That is where he will be buried. So they dug a grave, and from his house they pushed and poked his body and dragged it all the way outside of Mecca and pushed him into his grave. And then they didn't want to put the soil back in, they threw stones from far away and filled the grave up from far, because nobody wanted to be infected with this, whatever he had. And so this was the ending of Abu Lahab, and this is how he died. And that's how he left this world, and yet he awaits in the next world, where Allah says, Tabbat yada Abi Lahabin wa tab. That Abu Lahab, the punishment that awaits him is mentioned in the Quran. So in regards to Sayyidina Abbas and his wife, radiyallahu ta'ala anhum, that Lubaba, they mentioned that she was the second person or second woman to become Muslim. And in regards to Sayyidina Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, and her husband, that he was secretly Muslim, and he was sending news back to the Prophet ﷺ, because he remained in Mecca, and he was sending news back to the Prophet ﷺ in Medina what was happening. And this is mentioned by Ibn Ishaq. So the Sayyidina Abbas was already Muslim, and others say that he became Muslim after the Battle of Badr. That after the Battle of Badr, this is when he became Muslim. But as Ibn Ishaq mentions, he was Muslim before this, but he was secretly Muslim, and others weren't aware of his Islam. And so after this, now we see that when the Prophet ﷺ, he returns with the army back to Medina, and he was bringing the good news of that the Muslims, they went out to intercept this caravan, but they ended up meeting the Quraysh and fighting the Quraysh and then defeating the Quraysh. So this was a huge excitement for the Prophet ﷺ, and he enters Medina with this news. But it's on this day that he arrives in Medina, he hears the news that his daughter Ruqayya radiyallahu ta'ala anha, that she is passed away. So on the day that Zayd comes to Sayyidina Uthman bin Affan, who didn't go out to Badr, he remained, because his wife was sick, he remained in Medina to take care of his wife. So we see here that there was a command to come out, and Sayyidina Uthman didn't go. Why? Because he had a responsibility towards his family. So it shows that how one's responsibility towards their family outweighs many other things, and where Sayyidina Uthman bin Affan stayed at home to take care of his wife radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And the one that the Prophet ﷺ said, Uthman cannot do no wrong. And he said Uthman is the possessor of the two lights, the Nurayn, the two lights, being the daughters of the Prophet ﷺ. And so Zayd brings the news to Uthman that the Muslims were victorious, and Sayyidina Uthman was at the bedside of his wife. And when the news came that the Muslims were victorious, and on that day she radiyallahu ta'ala anha passed away. And she, Sayyidina Ruqayya, she migrated with Sayyidina Uthman, as we mentioned, to Abyssinia. When she was in Abyssinia and she came back, that she heard of her mother's passing, and that her mother had passed away, that she was still in Abyssinia. And then when she returned, her mother she she asked when she entered upon Sayyidina Fatima Zahra that where's my mother, that when she came back to Mecca, and they told her that Sayyidina Khadija had passed away radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma. And so Sayyidina Ruqayya had this sadness of leaving her home Mecca, going to Abyssinia, then returning and hearing even more devastating news that her mother had left this world, and that this was the treatment that of her father, what he was facing at the hands of the Quraysh. And then also while she was there in Abyssinia, her son Abdullah passes away. So all of these difficulties that she went through radiyallahu ta'ala anha, and she was still young, and then now finally she radiyallahu ta'ala anha passes away herself, and she leaves this world, and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he returns to Medina only to enter upon Medina and to be told that his daughter has passed away, Sayyidina Ruqayya. So he went immediately to her house and to Sayyidina Uthman, and he embraced Sayyidina Uthman, kissed his daughter, and then he weeps and he sits there crying and weeping with Uthman radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam has now, he's victorious and Allah has given him this great victory, but he also, Allah has taken away from him something, and he's taken away his daughter Sayyidina Ruqayya radiyallahu ta'ala anha. And the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam immediately begins to prepare the janazah, and the body of our mother Ruqayya is washed, and then she's shrouded, and her janazah is prayed and led by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he himself digs her grave, and he descends into her grave, and he himself places his daughter into the grave radiyallahu ta'ala anha. So we see then this was when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam returned to Medina, and then it's in the following month, in the month of Shawwal, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam now goes out for another expedition to fight the Banu Qaynuqa because of their betrayal. The Banu Qaynuqa were one of the Jewish tribes in Medina, but they had betrayed and broken the covenant and the agreement between the Muslims and themselves. And so what happened was that there was a Muslim woman who went out to the marketplace, to the Qaynuqa market, and she went to a Jewish jeweler who was selling, and she was covered. She was wearing a face veil, and she was fully covered radiyallahu ta'ala anha. And some men started to provoke her. Some of the Qaynuqa Jewish men started to provoke her, trying to get her to reveal her face and lift her face veil. And as she sat down at the jeweler's, that because she wasn't removing the veil, they then tied her thobe, the bottom of her thobe, to the top, so it's higher up, so that when she stands up, that it will show her awra, her nakedness. And so when she stood, her awra was visible, and so she screamed out aloud and panicked, and all the while these men were laughing. And so one of the Muslim men, Sahaba, who was there, he sees this and he's angry, so he comes to the jeweler and he beats the jeweler so severely that he kills him. And when he kills him, then the Jews set upon this Muslim man, because he's killed the jeweler. The Jews set upon him and they kill him. And then the family of this Jewish man hear what's happened, and the family of this the Muslim man hear what's happened, and this huge brawl breaks out in the markets in Qaynuqa in Medina. And so this was in the month of Shawwal, after the Battle of Badr, in the second year after Hijri. So the Prophet ﷺ, news comes to him that this is what has happened, that this Muslim man has been killed, and this was what happened, and that this woman, this is what happened to her, and the agreement between the Qaynuqa and the Muslims had been broken. So the Prophet ﷺ immediately sets out with men, and he lays siege upon the Banu Qaynuqa, and he lays siege for them for, they say, 15 days, until they give up, and that they are banished from Medina, and their wealth is taken, and they are banished and told to that they are safe, but they have to leave Medina, that they can't remain in Medina because of their betrayal. And all this time, one of the greatest hypocrites that there was, Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, that he came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he had an agreement he had alliance with the Banu Qaynuqa. So he went to the Prophet ﷺ and he says to the Prophet, spare my allies during this 15-day siege. He says, spare my allies, they're my friends. So the Prophet ﷺ ignores him. And so he grabs the Prophet ﷺ by his chainmail from the neck. And he grabs the Prophet ﷺ and the Prophet ﷺ angrily tells him, he says, woe unto you, let me go. And he carries on holding the Prophet ﷺ, Abdullah ibn Ubay, and he then pleads to the Prophet ﷺ that he has offered them protection and that the Prophet ﷺ should free them and let them go. And so the Prophet ﷺ angrily then says, they are yours, take them, they are yours. And the Prophet ﷺ commands them that they should leave Medina, and they are no longer allowed to remain in Medina, and they all leave and go to head towards Syria. So during this time as well, that back in Mecca, we see that Safwan ibn Umayyah bin Khalaf being the owner of Sayyidina Bilal, that his son Safwan, he's sitting there in Mecca and he's talking to his cousin Umayr ibn Wahab. And Umayr ibn Wahab he took part in the Battle of Badr. He was there with his son, and his son was taken prisoner into Medina. And Umayr ibn Wahab is the cousin of Safwan. And so they're sitting there and they're discussing what took place, and they're cursing the Prophet ﷺ. And Umayr, he says to Safwan, he says that if I didn't have a debt, that I've got all this debt, but if I didn't have a debt, that I would go to Medina and a family, then I would go to Medina and I would kill the Prophet ﷺ. But because I have this debt to pay, that I'm concerned about my family, that I can't go. And so Safwan says to Umayr ibn Wahab, he says that, I will take care of your debt and I will take care of your family. Don't worry about that. If anything happens, I will take care of that. So you go out and kill the Prophet ﷺ. So Umayr sets out for Medina in secrecy, and he comes to Medina, he enters Medina in secrecy, and he goes straight to the masjid because he knows the Prophet ﷺ will be there. And as he enters into the masjid, Sayyidina Umar sees him and recognizes him immediately. And he goes to the Prophet ﷺ to tell the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet ﷺ says to Umar, bring him to me. And so they go and they bring Umayr to the Prophet ﷺ. And Umar has gone with his sword, but he's been commanded to bring Umayr to the Prophet. So Umar doesn't kill him, but he apprehends him and brings him to the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet asks, he says, why have you come to Umayr? And he says that I've come to negotiate the release of my son. You've got my son and I want to reach an agreement with you that you release him. And so the Prophet ﷺ then asks, well, why do you have your sword? If you've come to make an agreement, why do you have your sword with you? And so he says, what good was this sword at Badr? And this sword is a useless sword, and what good was it? So the Prophet ﷺ then asks him again, he says, why did you come? And he says the same thing, that I've come to make an agreement for you releasing my son. So the Prophet ﷺ, he says, no, you didn't, that's not the truth, because you and Safwan were sitting in Mecca in this place, and you said to Safwan that if it were not for my debt and my family, that I would go and kill Muhammad. And that Safwan said to you that he will take care of your debt and your family, so you go. And you made this plan, you devised this plan, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came in between your plan, and He's the best of planners. So Umayr immediately, when he hears this from the Prophet ﷺ, he knew that there's no other way that the Prophet ﷺ can know this. So he immediately says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. And he becomes Muslim there in front of the Prophet ﷺ. So then the Prophet ﷺ, to honor him, and now he's a Muslim, so he says to the Sahaba, he says, go, take him and teach him his religion and free his captive. That his son is our captive, but because he's a Muslim now, free his captive. And so they take him and they free his son. So Umayr then, after a period, he returns with permission from the Prophet ﷺ. He returns to Mecca. He says to the Prophet ﷺ that let me return and go back to Mecca, and let me call others for all that I've done wrong. I want to go and call others in Mecca and call them to the truth. And because he was from the leaders of the chiefs in Mecca, so the Prophet ﷺ agrees. And when he returns, he meets with Safwan, And he immediately, this is his cousin, so he wants to tell Safwan about Islam and call him to Islam. And he tries and he tells Safwan that this is the truth and you should embrace Islam. And Safwan immediately begins to curse him and swear, and he swears that he will never talk to him again and not even look at him again, and that he doesn't want anything to do with him. And so Umayr, whilst he's in Mecca, they say a number of people converted and became Muslim at his hands, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And then he finally himself makes hijrah to Medina after a while, and then at the Fath al-Makkah he returns back to Mecca. And at the Fath al-Makkah, that Safwan, when the Prophet ﷺ entered, and with Umayr, that Safwan, he flees Mecca because he was scared that what would happen to him, that he had devised this plan to kill the Prophet ﷺ. He had done all these things against the Muslims, so he thought that he would never be forgiven, that it's impossible that he would receive forgiveness, even though Abu Sufyan had told him that they would be safe. That Safwan flees Mecca. So Umayr goes looking for his cousin because he's beloved to him and he still has this love for him. So he goes looking for him. So he goes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says to the Prophet ﷺ that he asks for protection for Safwan. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, yes, if you afford him protection, then he's protected. And so Umayr goes and he finds Safwan and he persuades him to come back to Mecca, and he brings him in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And when he's brought in front of the Prophet ﷺ, he takes his shahada there, Safwan as well, radiallahu ta'ala anhum. So we also see here at the Battle of Badr, after Badr, that the husband of Sayyidina Zainab, Abu al-As, that he was taken prisoner. And so Sayyidina Zainab, she's still in Mecca, so she sends ransom for her husband to be released. And so she sends her mother's necklace. And so when the Prophet ﷺ receives it and he sees the necklace of Sayyidina Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, and he immediately remembers his dear wife and he begins to weep and he refuses to take it. And he refuses to take the ransom, and he releases Abu al-As, and he says, with the condition that you go back to Mecca and send me my daughter, because the Prophet ﷺ yearned to be with his daughter. So he asked for his daughter be sent to him, Sayyidina Zainab. And so when Abu al-As returned back to Mecca, he prepared to send Sayyidina Zainab to Medina. And now Abu Sufyan in Mecca became the chief of the Quraysh because of all the others that had been killed at Badr. And so it was also in this year that Sayyidina Ali and Sayyidina Fatima were married, and prior to their marriage, that a number of people had come to the Prophet ﷺ asking for Fatima's hand, including Abu Bakr and Umar, who wanted to be close to the Prophet ﷺ and be from the family. So they wanted to be married to Sayyidina Fatima, and the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't reply to them. Until then, he gathered the Sahaba around and he said that Allah has commanded me to marry Fatima to Ali, karamallahu wajhu wa radiyallahu ta'ala anha. And so Sayyidina Ali was married off. So when Sayyidina Ali, he came in, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned it to him, and Ali agreed, and they were married off with the dowry of mahar of 400 mithqal of silver. And Sayyidina Ali had nothing, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that he had nothing to give Sayyidina Fatima, that all he had was his armor, his sword and his shield, and he sold his shield to Sayyidina Uthman for 500, and then 400 of that was the mahar. And so when they were married, Sayyidina Uthman came with a wedding gift of Sayyidina Ali's shield as a wedding gift back to Sayyidina Ali, karamallahu wajhu wa radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in. Inshallah, we will stop there, and tomorrow we will look at the battle of Uhud, inshallah, which is the next great battle that took place, and we will look at that battle, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ya Rabbana tarafna bi annana iktarafna wa annana asrafna ala ladha ashrafna fatub alayna tawbat taghsil kulli hawba wastunna nad arati wa amir raati waghfir li walidina rabbi wa mawludina wa ahli wal ikhwani wa sa'ir al khillani wa kulli dhi mahabba aw jiratin wa sahba wal muslimina ajma amin. Rabbi isma' فضلا وجود منا لا باكتساب منا بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي وصلى وسلم ربي عليه عد الهبي وآله وصحبه إدادة تشي صحبي والحمد لله في البدء والتناهي سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين في كل لحظة أبدا عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزينة عرشه ومداد كلماته اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه الفاتحة.